Welcome to the Westminster tradition, where we unpack lessons for the public service. I am Danielle Elston, recovering public servant and Managing Director of Good Government Advisory. I am on the very hot lands of the Kaurna people today, and I am joined by a very special guest, Salli Cohen. Hello, Salli.
Hello, Danielle. It is just so fabulous to be here. And I can't believe, I think your lands are way hotter than where I am. I'm on absolutely magical Larrakia country, the mighty Larrakia people. And I'm in Garramilla. So for people who may not know those countries, I'm in Darwin in the Northern Territory. And I think for once, well, not for once, Adelaide does get very hot and the rest of Australia gets really hot too. But it seems to be bonkers around Australia today, and we're just hot and sweaty as usual. Like it's
BAU for the Larrakia people and for the people of Darwin.
Yep.
So, following on from Caroline's episode about how to do big things in government, we're going to stick with that kind of theme of reform and talk about the tools that help policy officers ride that policy development roller coaster. Salli recently published her first book. I say first, so there you go. That's just throwing down a small gauntlet of challenge there, because first indicates there will be a second. Distilling your expertise and passion for policy into Rollercoaster, How to Be a Bloody Good Policy Officer, which we will, of course, link in the show notes. Salli is a strategist, storyteller, and quiet force for reimagining what policy should be. Guided by values of equity, self-determination and respectful collaboration, and grounded in her principle of absolute humanity, she works with organisations and communities to ensure they have tools, relationships and confidence to drive the changes desired by those that they serve. Bringing more than 30 years' experience across government, Aboriginal-controlled organisations, for-purpose entities and the private sector, and now in her own policy practice, The Policy Room. The first book was published in 2025. That's a very long list of achievements there, Salli. Welcome to the podcast. It's just an incredibly long list. So with that long and varied policy career, coming at it from multiple angles, from different levels of government, the NGO sector, the Aboriginal community controlled sector, what made you think that now was the moment to write this book?
Really good question. And just to dive that for 1 second, there is a second book coming.
Oh, I didn't know that. So, I
just announced it right here first.
Excellent. I was going to say, but I was throwing the gauntlet down because once I put first book, I'm like first indicates not last. So that's excellent.
Yeah. The working title at the moment is There's a Grass Seed in My Bamboo Undies. We can come back to that later.
Yeah, really right.
Okay,
yeah. I'm desperate to know what that is. Okay, so if we leave the second book for the second, because I'm very curious to know what that will be, what made you think now was the moment to write Rollercoaster?
I think it comes from, one, having the time like you. I love how you describe yourself as a recovering public servant. I think that's very apt. After, just over 21 years as a public servant, I decided to leave and go out on my own. And a book had been whispering in my ear for a while, but I didn't want to be constrained by public servant constraints. I wanted to write the book that I wanted to write. So that was a big part of it. But I also think, Danielle, I came to, I suppose, a time in my life. I mean, you say I've done a lot of things, but I'm not, I don't describe myself as old, but I'm not young either, so it kind of makes sense. It was a book that I wanted to write to give back. It's the book I wanted to have that I didn't have when I started out. And it's a way of me continuing to contribute to the public service, which by default is giving back to the communities that I serve.
So it was your podcast. It was some leave and make a podcast, some write a book. Who were you writing it for when you sat down to start? Because one of the things I notice about it is, and we're going to end up using lingo that I hate, but in some ways it kind of zero bases or brings you back to what were the original principles that you started. I got a Bachelor of Public Policy Bachelor of Arts Public Policy as my undergraduate degree, where there were tools and there was process. And then when you've done it for a long time, you end up solving the problem of the day or designing to the latest kind of idea that's out there, and that this was bringing it back to some of the more basic principles, which in some ways says to me it's for starting out policy officers. But actually, as I was reading it, I was like, oh, I forgot that. Oh, I forgot that. And whether, in fact, I do a lot of management 101 where I get directors and executive directors and leaders who come along, because some of the basics of it after such a long time have kind of just drifted off out of their kind of memory through time.
Sure.
So was it designed for emerging and junior policy officers, or do you think it's valuable for, I suppose, every level?
Absolutely the latter. When you talk to people and are guided by people who actually know how to write a book, because that's a whole thing.
Yeah.
One of the first things they say to you is, who you're writing for. And of course I said, oh, anyone, everyone, the world. And they go, no. Sorry, you have to be really, really, really targeted on who your audience is. So while which is interesting, and it does help the whole writing process. That said, while my book is for the newbies, the people starting out, you and I have both experienced across our policy careers, whether that be inside of government or outside of government, people who find themselves in policy. There's been a shuffle, there's been portfolio changes, there's been an election. And I had people in my teams who were sensational operational frontline service delivery people. So what we call SMEs now. I had to keep asking people, what's a SME? I thought that was like a movie, like the Smurfs, subject matter expert. But for them, policy was this bizarre, nebulous concept that horrified people because, one, they usually, frontline people usually hate policy and really get cranky with the people who write it, because it's like, do you want to talk to us for a minute?
Yeah,
find out how this really works. So I have the newbies in mind, and then those people who may be mid-career or end of their career and suddenly terrifyingly find themselves in a policy role. But exactly as you said, Danielle, we get into our own loops. We get into our own way of doing things and sitting back and going, oh my goodness, oh, actually we should talk to people who are going to be impacted by the policy. And it's really useful to find out from those people who strongly object to the policy.
Absolutely.
So it has become, even though I was very targeted on the newbies, it has successfully filled that desire of mine to make sense to a wider audience than that. And then I have non-policy people who read it, and that just blows my mind. That makes me so happy because it's giving insights, because policy impacts every single part of our life.
Right? I mean, that's sometimes when you have this conversation with regular people and they question the value of government or the work, particularly of, shiny bum, the cardigan crowd, as opposed to the front line workers, and you kind of list off the decisions that are made in their name that impact them. We don't do an excellent job, I think, of talking to the community, and it's really a political job, a ministerial job, about the amount of power government does have over you and how all of those designs of those decisions will impact what it is that you can and can't do. But back to your original one, who it was for, I think we less and less have straight up and down the line policy officers, particularly in state and territory governments. So I think, probably slightly more in the Commonwealth with some big bulk graduate rounds where they actually train up a generation of policy officers. But I think in the States, it's often that you come to roles in reform or IGR or anything else where you were a teacher, you were a lawyer in the justice system, you were in environmental science, and now you're in the policy and IGR team of the Environment Department. And we seem to do almost nothing to transition, because that comes with like 20 years of thinking in a certain way. Educators think in a certain way, lawyers think in a certain way, scientists think in a certain way. And I recommend for our listeners who come from that to grab Salli's book, particularly because We don't offer many other ways for you to go, okay, I'm still a SME, I'm still a lawyer, but I'm now in a team or a process where I need to design a new such and such justice policy, which has a set of skills that I haven't actually been trained in. And so it's the translation piece between your original professional background, which doesn't always happen at a junior level. You can become a really senior manager and then shift into a reform team. And this kind of zero basing of like, what the heck is policy and what am I supposed to be doing here would be really handy.
Absolutely. And so I think what you've touched on there, Danielle, about I don't think we do well, and I say this across all governments from regional councils right up to the Commonwealth federal government, we don't give people a starting point from which to learn, understand, and build in an awareness of what policy is. We award senior policy staff, you mentioned I did the EMPA with ANZOG, masters, etc. But those people who are coming in, who are the foot soldiers of policy, regardless of their background, and I'll say this even for people who've come through, in be it under or postgrad studies in policy, when you're thrown into the thick of it, when it becomes real, you're out of the textbooks, you're out of doing a presentation back to the class, back to the professors or whatever. It's a very, very different gig. And my experience when I started out, and so as I mentioned to you before we started chatting, that I moved here from France. I was in the private sector. I didn't know it, but policy was shaping my world then and there. And the French have got a quirky way of doing things, like they have with many things. And then I was working for the company here from Darwin and doing a lot of international stuff. And then I got offered a job and won a job as a senior policy officer, which in itself is bonkers. I am forever grateful. But at that stage, I didn't really get what government did. Like, it was this thing. I had no idea what policy was, and nobody could tell me what it was. Nobody could say to me, oh, it's this.
Yeah.
There'd be these, I find them really difficult, and I say this with utmost respect, but these overly academic, lofty statements that I hear it and I go, okay, so what does that mean? Mm-hmm. So when I hear the word a neurosurgeon, I know what that means. But when somebody says, oh, it's somebody who operates on your brain, I go, oh, right, okay.
Right, yeah.
Cool. Policy, oh, it's an intention or direction of a sitting government. And just like, what does that mean, people?
Oh, it's a way of, I think I say this on the pod all the time, it's also a way of keeping us very exclusive and special and like unable to be kind of easily understood. So it's a way we select people in and out of our systems. And so you then go, okay, well, I'm going to define it as change. Yep. You define it really simply as change. What does that definition, do you think, do to help policy officers see their work more clearly?
Yeah. So the short definition, as you so rightly say, is policy is a change. My longer definition, which fortunately is not too long, is policy is a change that takes people or people and things from where they are now to where a government or an organisation wants them to be.
Yeah.
So that gives us two insights. One, you've got the word change in there, but it's showing that there's this momentum, there's movement. We're going from now to somewhere else in the future. There's movement, there's behavioural change, there's stuff that's happening. The other insight that it gives that I think is really important that we often forget is policy is not just in the remit of governments.
Yeah.
Sure, what we call public policy, which is the policy that governments make, regardless of the level, impacts so much other policy, be they private sector, NGO, for-purpose, ACO, whatever. But they also have their own policies that they have just this is how we're going to do things and this is how we want things to happen. So how does that help people? I think it takes us away from those very lofty definitions that I struggled with and that I still to this day don't truly understand with all of my experience still don't go, I don't have a response of, okay, I now know what I'm doing or what I need to do, what this implies that I need to do. And it's something that is tangible, it's a grasp. And having tested this on a number of different people, including people who've done my courses, etc., it was wonderful. I did some training for the Office of the Chief Scientist. And as you just said, you've got a whole lot of people coming in there, extraordinary backgrounds with minds. I just wanted to sit there with a bowl of popcorn, perhaps a glass of bubbles, and just listen to them talk. Fascinating. But there was this immediate, oh, okay, we're talking about a change. We can grasp that concept.
Yeah.
Because fundamentally, every single policy is creating a change in some way, shape, or form that is going to, at sometimes, force us, oblige us, regulate us to behavioural change or to consider doing things differently. Like our power and water bills that have those nudges on it about, this quarter against last quarter's bill. But if you're being power and water wise, you actually dropped your bill by X amount, So that's where I think the importance, and people challenge that statement as well, which I think is great. Because you want those debates, you want the discussion. But it simplifies this really weird thing that's called policy.
And sometimes, because it can be lots of things. When I think about the influence the private sector can have with policy, the first thing that jumps into my mind is their work from home posture. So it's a set of rules. So they change their rules from everyone working at home to hybrid or this or that, and that has a spill-on effect, not just for their workforce, but for rents in a CBD, and then the superannuation funds who own them, and then the coffee person in the bottom of that building. So we use the word policy so broadly, and often it is a set of rules. The change was the decision. So, again, work from home, particularly with large-scale private sector, the decisions they've made on that policy have had these kind of significant ramifications around the place. But the simple part of that is that they changed their rules as well. And I think that's something that is easier to understand for others. But that's something you can do. Like if you are the head of HR in a very large corporate and you have worked with all the leaders and it's like, we're going to do X as our work from home policy, you get that past your board or your executive, you're good to go. In government, it's trickier because policy officers are not decision makers. Their work has enormous consequences, but the system that we work in, the Westminster system we work in, is that the elected officials of the day set a direction, and often you are trying to retrofit some kind of methodology to the decision of an elected official. So how do policy officers how could they think about their power and their influence in this world where you are not the decision maker, but you often have to do the design?
It's really important, and that's also something else that we don't explain well to people when they're starting out in policy and to the others who are working with them, to understand what is the role of a policy officer vis-a-vis the role of decision makers, vis-a-vis the role of influencers who are influencing decision makers and those who are influencing policy officers as well. Our role is to prepare evidence-informed, and I'd love to have a yarn with you at some point in this about, evidence-informed versus evidence-based.
Oh, yes.
To develop evidence-informed advice that gives those decision makers robust information about usually the three choices that we give them, ways to go to bring their policy platforms to life. Our job is to turn over every single possible stone that we can within the ridiculous timeframes that we have, i.e., can you do this by the lunchtime? And I've given it to you at 11:15. Within the timeframes, within the resources, within the budgets, et cetera. But our job is to do everything that we possibly can to understand how this particular policy platform that the government wants to bring out, or it might be, the senior executive in a department for internal policies. How can this best be achieved? What are the risks? What are the challenges? Who is it going to impact and in what ways? You just identified they're talking about, the working from home policies, how that will impact the local coffee shop, how suddenly landlords who were, getting these great rental returns, are no longer getting them because people who aren't impacted by a policy deliberately will be impacted in some way, shape or form. And then there are others who are going to be pretty cranky that they're not benefiting from a particular policy. So there's all the
elected officials are never good at that or love it. This idea, one of the things I struggle with sometimes is there's a new bar that I don't remember existing, or when you're junior, you can't see that bar, which is almost a request to please design a policy where there are no losers. And it's like, mate, trade-offs is the game. And there are almost always, not always, but losers as well as winners in policy design. And so the appetite of your political masters for the people who do not benefit is lower than I think it's ever been before.
And I think that's an absolute reflection of the sign of the times. There's the constant scrutiny. Obviously, I don't think it's a 24-hour cycle for media. It's all the time. There's no end in sight. There's no reprieve. But our job is to prepare that evidence-informed advice, to give a solid and sound structure. And you're absolutely right. One of the challenges in this, when we talk about frank and factual and frank and fearless, flat and factual, frank and fearless, my apologies. Our job is often not to give decision makers, and this is going to sound weird, what they want, but what they need. Oh my giddy aunt, does that take a good dose of courage?
Oh, doesn't it? And I suppose that's my question. How do policy officers, and I think if you're a policy officer, that's something that's a discomfort that your leader has to sit with. So a lot of it's about the chain. Like you can develop what they need, but then at some point some boss along the line is going to have to show them what the advice is that they need. And that does take a lot of courage.
Yeah. And look, and the other thing is, I think discomfort sits at all levels. And I'll talk to that in a second. But at some point, the authorising environment, the decision maker is going to say, this is how I want it, decision made. Policy officers, change your skates and get in the rink with us. That's their job. Our job is to respond to that accordingly, right? Our contracts are we are directed by the government of the day or the senior executive members of the day. Now, I think there does, and certainly for me, there were times across my career where I say personal values, but they're also my professional values, were at risk of being corrupted or had been corrupted, and I had to move away, and that was my choice to do so. So even though your most senior staff will sit in discomfort, the most junior ones will too, because you'll get those people who come in who are passionate about their thing. And suddenly their thing is getting cut up and shifted on the playing board and new things are being introduced. They're going, but that's not, but this is the world that we're in. But it's really, really hard. And I think we need to teach people how to cope with that as well. We just throw people
so it's not just the tools; it's a lot of how you cope with the psychological parts of. I suppose before I move on, what is that evidence based versus evidence informed? Because if you are an SME and a policy expert, it can be particularly tricky for you if the direction that it ends up heading in you feel is not based or even has any of the evidence that you know to be true in it. What is the difference between evidence-based and evidence-informed?
Yeah. So evidence-based has been, I think traditionally the terminology that we've used in policy, though when I started out in policy, I don't think base or evidence ever came into any conversation I was involved in. And it's really the health sector that developed, and which makes complete sense, right? We need to build an evidence base of how our procedures, our surgeries, our medicines, et cetera, work, how people respond to them, what works, what doesn't, what's risky, what's not risky. Makes complete sense. And it makes complete sense across a world of other sectors. The difference in the nuance between evidence-based and evidence-informed, is evidence-informed absolutely has to have that evidence base. But alongside the evidence base, you have the expertise and the experience of the people who are working within that particular area that the policy is focusing on, the expertise and the experience of the policy people who are developing, designing said policy, but also within the cultural, moral, traditional environments of the place where the policy is going to be rolled out. So let me give you a very simplified example. Let's take somebody who has studied to be a surgeon. They've got their degree. They've popped the brass plaque up on the wall that says, Dr. Whoever, brilliant surgeon. They start out very exciting. They're building their client, they've got their patients. Let's fast forward that very same surgeon 30 years to my age, right? Their approach to their work is going to be very, very different. Let's say they've worked for Médecins Sans Frontières. They've done work in, countries that are really struggling to keep their people well, to keep them alive, to keep them safe with quality of life. They've had patients that they've lost. They've had patients where things have worked well. They've worked in communities with very strong religious structures around them and very different decision-making, whether somebody has an intervention or medical intervention or not. Their approach to their work is going to be very different. They're not just, and I say this again with great respect, going to the books and the research and going, this is the medicine that we apply here. That's the difference between evidence-based and evidence-informed. Evidence-informed brings in a real human richness and experience that really flips your lid on how you approach your policy.
That's fascinating. And I am always of the so that's really interesting. And particularly the other thing, if that meant that's a very strong health example, but where that shows up a lot in, say, social services or actually lots of government services is the evidence, because often the evidence base is actually quite narrow for what how people will engage in the new online tool or whatever else. And it turns out once it rolls down the line, well, the evidence said they were all going to click on it. So, well, the evidence was a tiny, and then we pulled some evidence from the private sector that didn't really align with how people engage with government, because we don't engage with our real estate agent in the same way that we engage with our government, because we have a choice in one and not a choice in the other, all of that kind of thing. So it forces policymakers to be more open-minded, that also the evidence has limitations to it. So the evidence,
we've got to be really clear about that, right?
Yeah.
When we're putting our advice back to decision makers, we've got to be really clear about, sure, this works here,
yep,
or over there, but it hasn't been tested here, so we're not sure.
Yep, absolutely.
It suggests that it's going to be useful, but we can't nail that.
And so you encourage. So when I was reading it, and you're encouraging policy officers to listen closely to how politicians, the media, even friends and family are talking about policy, I remain baffled sometimes when I meet senior leaders who don't. When you say, yesterday in Queensland, which might not be the jurisdiction you're in, they made that big announcement about X, and obviously the ABC's been running all week on something, and they look at you completely blankly. And I think it's a baseline requirement that the headlines of the day, the general gist of kind of public discourse, is something that every leader, certainly, and then most particularly of that central agency or policy officer type role should be doing. But it's not actually it's less a mandated part of life than I would have expected. Why do you think it matters so much that policy officers and people working on policy are listening and engaging? Because if you listen to politicians and the media and friends and family, you're going to get a lot of crackpot views, including in your friends and family. Like, why is that important? Why do you need to know that when you are designing things for government? Why do you need to know that Uncle Darren thinks that the government's got a conspiracy about airport closure times? And why is it important to hear that and know that?
A couple of reasons. one extreme end, if we don't have our antennae out, our ears switched on and our eyes wide open, we can miss really big stuff that can be harmful, stuff that can be dangerous potentially, and stuff that we just don't know. I think one of the biggest risks that we have as public servants, regardless of where you are in the chain, we get inside this elite bubble where, because we're holding the pencil or the keyboard, we suddenly think that that power that elected officials have is ultimately bestowed on our shoulders, and we are able to make these decisions on behalf of others. We have to be curious about our work, Danielle. So even the crackpot stuff, which you've got to listen to understand, because you've got to arm your decision makers. We're on the front steps of Parliament House, and they're going to get a question potentially from a crackpot journalist who's saying, but climate change is not a thing. We know this. You're bonkers. You've got to be prepared for that stuff. But it's from, and this is where the evidence informed comes in, when we're talking to, and most importantly, listening to those people who have lived experience of something or the absence of something or the impact of an absolute tsunami of things, we can better understand how to design, develop and craft policies that are going to, I hate to say this, land better, that are actually going to drive the change that they're intended to change without causing harm. Now, every single policy, the minute it gets rolled out as we're launching this thing today, we know immediately there are going to be changes that need to happen. It's just have to, because people are going to respond differently. But when clangers are rolled out that shouldn't have been clangers, things happen, right? I think COVID taught us all how things can happen really unexpectedly. But there are things that happen that, I'm sorry, should have never happened. And if you and your team, and if you leaders, public servant leaders, if you are not opening your eyes and ears, your minds and your hearts to get on board to understanding because you serve the people. You're not there to go home feeling 10 foot tall and proud of yourself. You are there to serve your community, the communities that you are serving. They matter. Their voices matter. And actually, it's not your voice that counts. What counts is how you assimilate, synthesize, and bring together that wealth and richness of information into cohesive decision-making points for that authorising environment.
See, that's why you've probably just articulated my kind of twitchy one-eye passion about the diversity of the public service, and particularly class diversity, which is, we used to be a place for lots of first in family, and you would come in first in family professional, first in family tertiary educated, and you would come in as a trainee, and we would train you ourselves and then get you that qualification ourselves. We do less and less of it in every jurisdiction. And the problem there is that the people, if you just end up with a public service full of people whose family and friends are, in fact, a further narrowing funnel of where their barbecue is full of other public servants and other professionals and paraprofessionals, then you don't hear the experience of how this stuff is landing, and you can't bring that back into the work. And so if we become even more narrow and we make this decision, and this I hear this all the time, I don't read anything anymore because it's too right-wing, it's too inflammatory, it's too the media is X, the media is Y. Now, I haven't done a PhD on media bias, except I still know that people are picking up in Adelaide the Tiser, and they've got their radio on, and they are collecting up information. And if I take a view that I am too snotty to engage in that same information, we're just getting further and further away from the people we serve, because I'm only reading the briefing. I'm only reading the Saturday paper version or the deep dive or whatever else. I am not engaging in what most people are, which is, it's a heat wave today. There might be a fire. I hope we've properly prepared, or they're engaging in a different set of information. And I don't think we are in a position to cede all of that ground and say, well, it's half the time it's inaccurate, or it's so inflammatory, I'm not reading that. And then head back into the meeting where we figure out how to land something else on people. I think that it's it's a real problem, I suppose the disengagement from those conversations. What kind of insights do you think can come from that informal listening? But particularly, how do you sit with that criticism or hostility? Like, particularly now that I don't have a single portfolio, it means that when I go to a barbecue, I can be criticised for any government and any jurisdiction's decision and all portfolios. So it's like, that government you work with has X, Y, or Z. And I'm like, guys, I've never been near that with a 10-foot pole, but I now have to, like, okay, yep, okay. So how much of, you talk about the policy officer themselves a lot in your book. Part of that is sitting with criticism and hostility from the outside world. How do you manage that?
Ain't that the truth? Look, I think, it's so easy to respond with, oh, but you don't understand, and that's not true, and this is really, and we've got it, and we know, blah, blah, blah. I think that's a normal human reaction going to complete defense mode. When we learn how to, because it is a learning, because it's very, very hard, as you just said, you were doing this. I remember, and it was a moment where I went, oh my goodness. And I was doing one of those masterclasses that you and I were talking about, and somebody made the comment, but as a policy maker, you ... And I realized there is a misunderstanding or an interpretation of a policymaker and a policy officer being one and the same thing. So while policy officers, their business is developing, designing policy, the actual policymaker, the decision maker, is the authorising environment, right? And so, and this is not a cop-out where we're just following rules, because that's a really slack cop-out. I reckon that's really woeful. That was a really interesting moment for me. But I think we have to learn how to just let people say their bit. We're not holding the conversation. We don't hand out a straw. You can talk, you can't talk. Yeah. Just listen to what people say. God, this is so interesting. Tell me why this is annoying you.
Yeah.
That usually, this is not a sort of a coaching or mentoring session, but when you ask people genuinely, gosh, tell me why this is so important to you, or tell me why this makes you so angry, you can deflate a bit of the anger.
Yeah.
And actually get to the understanding. And you'll also come across people who may not be able to articulate that as well. But I've found that when we allow ourselves to listen as opposed to hold the mic and be the person who is right. We don't have to be right.
And I think the older you get and the more policy you work on, the more you realise there's probably not a right anyway. There's,
good grief,
five things that are better than the other 5 things, and that's about as good as you. That's what you can hope for as success.
Yeah.
So what, like in that thing of how to be a policy officer, what dispositions matter most in this work? Like, it's often very detail-orientated people, but then when you talk through that capacity to take in lots of informal information and synthesize, you talk about head, heart and gut and how they work together. What dispositions matter most in a policy officer, so that for our listeners, they're like, I want to spend more time on some of these things if I want to get into that type of work?
When I was growing up as a policy officer, the thing that we spoke about all the time was you had to be a good writer to be a policy officer. That seemed to be the thing. That was the thing. And so that bit I thought, oh, okay, I can write. The first time I wrote what we call in the Territory a cabinet submission, I had no idea what a cabinet submission was, didn't even know what cabinet was, to be honest. And my boss at the time came back and said, Sally, that's a lovely story, but that's not how we write cabinets. Do you want to tell me how you write these things? Because they're weird. Why do you put the recommendation first? Like, didn't get it. Anyway. So there are a number of dispositions or skills, but for me, I think number one is curiosity. Absolutely have to be curiosity about the world, the thing, and your version of the world in terms of, the world that you're working in. And obviously, global things will come into people's roles as well. And particularly if you are working in a global context, you have to be curious. You have to have empathy.
Yeah.
You have to.
Yeah. Yeah.
You have to have empathy, and you have to be humble. This is going back to what you and I were just talking about in terms of, people not feeling the need to read the news or whatever because of ... You've got to be humble, because your own position on everything amounts to diddly squat at the
Well,
end
it's
of the
one
day.
vote. It still remains one vote.
And if that
Our
person actually
system.
turns up to vote, So there's those things. And I think in terms of skill sets, we can't be everything in a policy team, which is hard, right? Because policy teams appear to be shrinking.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I love qualitative data. I'm very, very, very limited on quantitative data. I can only go so far with numbers. And then I get really nervous and really need somebody else to take charge. In fact, they should have taken charge from the get-go. So you need a mix of skill sets, and there's no soft skills, by the way. That's just crap, and there's no hard skills. We're just skills, right?
Yeah.
Because our soft skills, the empathy, humanity, like what's soft about that? You need that stuff. But people who are your traditional quantitative data nerds, we need you to help us do the triangulation of our qualitative data and build a narrative that's rich and powerful and shows where there's gaps and shows where there's unknowns. You do have to have an interest in serving. There has to be a desire to serve others, to make the world a better place.
Yeah.
I think one of the hardest things, Danielle, particularly for graduates, for younger people coming into the public service, be they coming in as policy officers or other titles, and as you rightly said, roles are so mixed up now. Many who I have met are wearing this extraordinary cape that bears the slogan, "We're here to save the world." And then you have that horrific crash landing when you find out that actually that takes a really long time, and what you thought was saving the world is not the way that they're approaching it. So you've got to be able to build up some resilience and stamina, and most importantly, have a group of people around you who you can go and talk to. We don't debrief necessarily like you would in frontline operations.
We say this all the time. Find your people, because part of getting better at thinking, which is effectively what a lot of government work is thinking, is by testing your ideas with other people and people who you feel safe failing in front of and all of that kind of thing. The book has lots of those tools and frameworks in them, which always makes me nervous. I won't lie, it makes me nervous. And sometimes when I go for work and people are like, okay, so it's change management, your proposal didn't have the ADCAR model in it or this model, and I'm like, oh, tell me what your problem is and we'll just cherry pick from the best of these things to solve what it is that you have in front of you, because one tool is almost never going to work for every situation. How do policy officers, because a lot of it's about confidence, so if you are more junior and you've got Sally's book and it's like, here's this tool and this framework and this this lovely diagram. Now, for me, that's awesome, because I'm like, I'm stuck in my head now on this problem. I could bring it back to some more kind of clarifying basics using these things. But how do policy officers use those without becoming kind of rigid or performative, which is, because then you become frustrated. You're like, it didn't fit into the flowchart way of going about identifying my authorizing environment. Now I'm lost. So is there a danger with tools and frameworks of becoming kind of rigid and frustrated and performative?
I think you're absolutely right. There are a couple of things. So in my book, I offer, 12 different tools and frameworks. So in policy, it's really interesting. We adopt these from all different sectors. Really interesting, where these tools come from. And the reason for putting tools in there, for one, was saying, look, here's a handful of them, but there are so many others out there. And I think at one point I say, if you just did a Google search on this, you'll come up with 500, then some options of what this could possibly look like. To start with, to help your thinking, to help unpack things, because often there's that sweaty hand feeling, your heart rate is increasing, your tummy butterflies are just going bonkers inside the jar, because you've got this thing that's hit your desk or hit the email that says, do an X now. Where do I start? So these are useful tools to help start conversations, to help start thinking, to help you say, because I love it actually when people go, actually that's not going to work, we need something else. Great. That's a bonus. I think the magic bullet, so that this doesn't become formulaic, that this is the only way we do things, because we are very much I keep saying we, and you and I are no longer in the public service.
I say we. You can take the girl out of the service, but not the service out of the girl, as far as I'm concerned.
Yes. I had another version of that I won't share. But anyway, we in the public service, in fact, across all sort of sectors, if anybody's done extended disc, one of the 4 profiles is S, which is standard and steady. We like things done the same way.
We like repeatable. We like
servants,
a template.
Yes, I hate templates. I hate policy templates. They drive me nuts. But anyway, so we want to do it this way. This is the way we've always done it. And, we'll even say that to decision makers. Oh, no, that policy idea that was floated years ago didn't work. It won't work now, right? So my magic bullet is you don't just do these things on your own. This is when you bring in your stakeholders. This is when you bring in even your decision makers. You can do something, with chiefs of staff. If you're at that level in the public service, you can say, hey, let's do this thing together and see where it takes us. That's where your magic bullet is, because once you've got different voices, different people, different experiences and expertise playing with that tool, that thing, it's going to look different every single time. And you'll want that. Yeah. You want that. So get your team to do it, but then take it out and invite, let's say you're working with the education sector. So you might have the union in there. You've got, people from the department. You've got teachers. You've got admin staff. We don't take control of it, but we facilitate them doing that exercise. Absolute policy gold in there.
Absolutely. Your work clearly reflects that territory-style policy environment, even if the book doesn't kind of label them as such. What's different about government work in a territory, and what does everyone not understand about that? I mean, the small state persecution we can always speak to. We can always speak to in the Westminster Tradition Pod what it is to be what I would say is Tasmania, South Australia and WA at the big table of, say, IGR. But being in a territory is another planet altogether, and particularly one that is vastly remote. I mean, I don't think there's any other kind of way it's different to the ACT as well. What is different about doing government work in a territory?
Well, I'll tell you this for nothing. We can get to Singapore and Bali far cheaper and quicker than you lot can. So no. And it's really interesting because when you ask that question, I'm like, oh, is it? But it is. It is different. And I think one of our problems is that sometimes when we are at these IGR meetings, and but it's very, very different in the territory, and people will go, oh, here they go again. So there are a couple of things. I think being a territory, be it's the ACT or the Northern Territory, we, were gifted self-government, but the Commonwealth government, and the Commonwealth can muscle in anywhere, right? But it can muscle in a far more muscly, bolshy, like we're coming in and too bad, too sad if you don't like it. Take the Northern Territory intervention,
absolutely
point in case in 2007-8, and do whatever we want whenever we want. So that is pressure and a challenge that we live with, sometimes not always consciously, because it can really come and slap us in the face. I think the other challenge is that you hear time and time again, and often we refer to Canberra. And this was particularly pre-COVID, before everybody did start working from home, because everybody in the Commonwealth was in Canberra pretty much. You had a few outposts, and I feel that those poor souls felt like that they were on another planet from Canberra. Yeah. Where Canberra policy, i.e. Australian government policy, would not have an inkling as to what was going on outside of Canberra, and would dictate policy platforms that had to be picked up and run with in the policy, and where the environment, the context and the reality just wasn't there. The evidence-informed approach wasn't there. I remember early parts of my career, there was a program run by the feds where computers were given to schools. Do you remember that? There was
Yep. Laptops
Yep. And this is even before laptops. This is big chunky monkey things, like with a back end to it.
Oh, okay. No, I'm thinking of the Rudd initiative where we
this is way
floated
before.
them everywhere. Yeah. Right.
And so, remote community schools got all of these big, lumpy, chunky things that were never used. because they didn't work that way. Actually, I'll tell you something in more recent history, and for the life of me, and I feel terrible about this, I can't remember the chap's name, this wonderful man, I want to say Chris, anyway, who was responsible for the rollout of the COVID vaccinations for regional and remote Australia.
Mm-hmm.
And again, when you think about the impact, obviously, of COVID, but the responses by governments to COVID across their states, nations, etc., was huge. But rolling out vaccinations in remote and very remote parts of Australia required a whole different set of thinking. And when I speak to people in the major cities, you've got infrastructure, you've got refrigeration, you've got places, clinics where people can go. And the rollout, particularly for First Nations people in remote and regional areas, was absolutely critical.
Absolutely.
But the infrastructure wasn't there. So don't just say book your appointment and turn up to the clinic, because there ain't no booking system. There ain't no clinic. And by the way, we're not all going to have access to fridges to store these vaccinations. So how does that work, people?
Yeah. I mean, my favourite one in concert with that is always the standard answer provided in many, many situations is see your regular GP. And I'm like, I have one. I have like 45 random different chronic disease things, so I have to. Most people don't have one. So it's like a standard government answer in health is often ask your regular GP. So after you've been to urgent care or this or whatever, you wrap it up with your regular GP. I'm always fascinated where they get the data as to who has one, because I just do not believe the numbers are as high as they think they are.
And this is where policy people, and I'll put myself into that category as well, we understand the world as it is real to us. So when you live in the major cities of Australia, which dictate how the rest of Australia works, your concept of what is available and what is not, and what is real and what is not, is vastly different. So I remember discussions at the time I was in Chief Ministers when, it was the sort of the leading into the NDIS being rolled out. And just what you pointed out, Danielle, about having a GP. Now, one of the fundamental premises of NDIS was for people and their families to have choice in service providers. When you have a disability or multiple disabilities and you live on an outstation,
you're not jumping on Mabel to find your 55 available care support workers in Oodnadatta or anywhere else like that. It just doesn't work like that.
So the negotiations that were undertaken, and in the Territory at the time, and you'd know Rachel Bacon, it was about the government had to be sort of the last resort of choice, because there was no choice. And even in the, Darwin, Alice Springs, and then the smaller regional areas, choice is this extraordinary concept. It's a bit like getting Dorothy's red shoes. I've always wanted a pair of those, but I've never found them.
Yeah.
And so we get on,
Yeah. The other part of that, I think, is when we talked to Minister Koutsantonis in South Australia about the conversation he had with the community on energy policy, and he pointed out that, he would pull up in his government ministerial car at a set of lights and someone would wind their window down and shout some energy policy advice to him at the lights. And there is something about proximity and scale and about implementation that can change the work of a government policy person in a way that you will quite literally run into your staff, your frontline workforce. There's only an X number of supermarkets in X numbers of areas, all of that kind of thing, which creates a different level of proximity to the frontline in a small jurisdiction, whether it's a territory or a state, than perhaps in some of the larger states. That changes how it operates and also changes how ministers operate, particularly in the territory, which is they are very close to the action, right? Like they are not close. Miles away and close to their public servants. Again, we're not talking big buildings and staffs of hundreds of thousands of people. It's it's a pretty tight group of people.
Yeah,
and so they're Yeah.
I now remember your question and those differences. Proximity, absolutely. You go to the shops, I do feel for elected members, whether I like them or not. You can't even go out in your grotty shorts and a torn T-shirt to go and pick
yes,
up
you can.
some milk and butter. They do, but you're bailed up.
Totally.
It's not your time. When I put on my grotty shorts and T-shirt, it's my time. It's not their time.
Yeah.
It's not their time, and that can be really annoying. And this is funny because this has got to contradict exactly what I said previously, but it can drive people insane when a minister comes in after the weekend or the footy match and says, "This is what we're going to do now," because they've just spent a night at a barbecue over a couple of beers talking to whoever, and you're like, mate, let's include this as part of our evidence-informed advice. Let's not ignore it, but it's not the bee's knees. The other thing that will happen in these, particularly in territories, but in smaller jurisdictions, is a minister will be inspired to act on a thing, and the base to do this, including drafting new legislation, amending existing legislation, even rescinding legislation from not even a handful of people. And I had a particular instance here where I had to lead a team where we were responding to, at most it was a group of 7 people, but fundamentally there were 2 key people who had strongly influenced a minister on a significant decision. And that's the way it was going. Now, ultimately what they were doing was important work, but there were very, very strong views about it that needed to be heard and brought on board and part of, notably First Nations voices, where this was going to be highly problematic. But we were riding on the shoulders of 2 people influencing the decision maker. So if you do have my book in front of you, or you're going to do the empathy mapping exercise to have and really think about who's influencing your decision makers. So important. I mean,
sometimes staffers say to me when I'm helping them translate a public sector voice into their own world, and they say, gosh, they manage who the minister can and can't see, and are paranoid about who they're seeing that's not on the books. When I say not on the books, as in informally turned up at a school fete and ended up at, talking about something else with someone else. And I'm like, I appreciate that. And you are totally allowed to feel like the public servants have no business being in the who the minister meets with game. Also, if your minister was less influenced by the very last person they spoke to, public servants may not be quite so anxious about their freewheeling their way through the world, because your minister may not have yet grasped the skill or developed the skill of taking that last person we heard and adding it to the blonge-monge cauldron of information we have to work on this, and instead goes, that sounded really simple, because it always sounds really simple. Whatever that stakeholder said always sounds simple. It never sounds complicated. They never come back and say, I heard this really complicated idea at a barbecue. They always come back and say, I heard this really simple way to solve this complicated problem at a barbecue, and that's what I want you to do. So there's a growth piece sometimes for ministers around the last person they spoke to, and particularly their own spidey senses in learning that when someone tells you there's a really simple solution to something, honestly, mate, the public service would have done it if it was that simple. Like,
I think there's a flip side to that as well, Danielle. I think sometimes the public service feels that they are the only people with the right to provide information or advice to a minister. You are not.
100%.
And that they don't want person X because they actually don't want to include their stuff in it. They want to try and ignore them. They're not aligned to what the public service position is. And we got to get over ourselves. And that's, again,
100%.
When I said policy gold, and I met with somebody the other day who was asking advice about how they actually access senior public servants to have discussions about their sector. How do they then influence the minister? And their concern is, we've tried with the public service. They don't want to hear us. And if we say that to the minister, then the public service is going to get really cranky with us. And I said, but you can position this very differently, but that shouldn't be happening. We don't have the right to veto who does or doesn't engage with the minister. That happens in the minister's office. They can do that.
Yeah.
But we are a democratic nation. Everybody's voices, even the potty ones that we might think are,
Yes, absolutely.
they have the right to be heard. And yeah, if a minister, and they do it, and it does drive us bonkers, but they are also executing their responsibilities as an elected official. I want you to pursue this line of inquiry.
Mm-hmm. I mean, oft said by me in various departments when we would have passionate policy officers and staff, but who were not doing that disposition management of the things not going in the direction that they thought they should, is if you don't like it, run for parliament. Like, there is limitations to these roles. If you would like to influence them in that kind of way, you need to be a parliamentarian, not a public servant.
Or just stay at the barbecue.
Yes.
Just stay there.
What you've had a really varied career and have now tried to wrap that up in a how-to, in a policy sense. What do you wish, obviously because there were so many things you wish in that first part, having arrived in Darwin from France, which has got to be one of the more unusual journeys I've heard of to Darwin. And there was no manual. There was no one who could tell you what even your job was. What do you wish you had understood earlier, and what's giving you hope about, I mean, you do a lot of training, you are engaging with emerging policy practitioners. What's giving you hope about the next generation, our young and emerging policy people, peeps?
I think so. The first part of your question is, what do I hope for the book? Is that what you said?
What do you wish you'd understood earlier? So you've obviously written the book for that that young Salli. Young Salli was one of the audiences for that book, I think.
Yeah. I think the thing that as I said, there is so much, starting with what is policy and how do you do it. I think the thing for me is, yes, we are public servants. Yes, we are obliged to behave in certain ways and to do certain things and not to do other things. But our own moral standards, our values and ethical considerations, don't hide them. If there are things that are going pear-shaped, we have to stand up and say them out loud.
Yeah.
We've had far too many instances in Australia, and the number of royal commissions are testament to that, where people should have stood up way earlier. And there are things that I regret to this day where, ultimately I did stand up, but I wish I'd stood up a whole lot earlier. That's the one thing, I think. Mm-hmm. What inspires me about the young people today who are coming into the fold, like, one, it gets me really excited that young people are even excited about policy. Like, hello, this is lovely. This is really lovely. There is a determination. There is a passion, which can trip you up. Both of those can trip you up. There is a genuine commitment, I think, to other. I think often public servant jobs have been seen as cushy. And I think that's a reasonable position to take. I think there are a lot of people who ride that wave and retire very comfortably without actually having given back a lot to their society. But I think the younger generation, when I look at my children who are adults now, they are really comfortable asking questions and pushing buttons. Go forth, I say.
Yes. No, there's something mildly terrifying about being questioned about my values and how I live them by emerging young policy practitioners that I find both terrifying and excellent, and makes me want to get out of the way as fast as humanly possible and let them be. Yeah, please.
I grew up in an era where people who are senior to you, it was the
deference, right? The deference.
Yes, you must always listen to the doctor. You never question that kind of thing. So when I started out as a public servant, and my professional life prior to that, that was very much what they say. You might underneath be going, "Oh my giddy aunt, why on earth are they doing that?" But you'd never put voice to those thoughts.
Yeah.
And I remember actually the first time this really surprised me was a woman who was working in my team, and she was the media manager. And we were at a meeting with all these very, very important people. And somebody had just done this very, very important blurb that I sort of caught a bit of the gist of it, but not a lot of it. And she leaned in and she said, "Could you please explain that to me? I don't understand." And I thought, oh, my God, you're so brave. Best questions in the world. People love answering those questions. Totally. You're smarter than me. You understand something I don't. Do that. that's what I'm excited about, because young people are very comfortable to say, what do you mean? How does that work?
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. That is, I agree. And I think that is one of the most exciting things we have to come, which is for Gen Xers who find themselves in serious leadership positions, they are going to be questioned in a way they would never have questioned authority when they were emerging themselves. And I think it's probably very good for both our practice and the quality of the work that we do to have all these kind of, all these questions, but also questions from so many different angles, from an ethical angle, from an environmental angle, from an economic angle. I think that will only improve our practice. Salli, thank you so much for your time today. The mug winner for this week's episode is, of course, Salli Cohen. And I think that's the first time, possibly to our own detriment or whatever else, that one has made its way to the territory, and we are keen to correct that. So Territorians, get in touch, tell us your stories, and we will make sure that we get more than one mug up there to Darwin, or better yet to Alice. So I'm really grateful for your time on the pod, and also for the time in crafting the book, because it's that care for the practice and the view to the future, like what am I going to leave for that next lot of emerging policy officers that will help them become really good at this. As I start to move out of the way of it, how can I help them step into it with more confidence and being able to ask more questions? So I'm really grateful for your time. Thank you so much for joining us, Salli.
Thank you, Danielle. And being on the Westminster tradition with my mug that I'm very proud of is just absolutely marvellous. It's made my year. Like, what a way to start 2026. Spectacular. Spectacular.
Well, let's see if we can make it better from there. So till next time.
Just some appropriately bureaucratic disclaimers. While we've tried to be as thorough in our research as busy full-time jobs and lives allow, we definitely don't guarantee that we've got all the details right. Please feel free to email us corrections, episode suggestions, or anything else at thewestminstertraditionpod@gmail.com. Thanks to Pampot Audio for our intro and outro music. Till next time.